Today here with me is Tanay. Tanay is the founder of Athelas. Analyzing a person's blood and the cells within it is often used to diagnose many health conditions and illnesses, from infections to leukemia and bone marrow disorders. Generally, it's a long and expensive process. You have to go to the doctor, have a sample taken, wait for a couple days for a trained professional to then analyze the blood and finally get your diagnosis. Athelas is using machine learning to dramatically improve the speed and efficiency of testing blood cells. From a simple finger prick's worth of blood, Athelas devices can monitor and help healthcare professionals to remotely care for patients. To date, over 30,000 people have used Athelas devices to monitor a range of conditions, including hypertension and diabetes. I'm really excited to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to chat through Athelas and just some of the work that we've been doing in the area.
Well, it's really exciting to have you on. Now, I think it's really exciting to try to take this on. Now, healthcare is a pretty big space. I mean, there's a lot to be done. Can you say a bit more about specifically why you decided to look at blood and specifically the things you're doing at Athelas? I mean, you started this many years ago. What inspired you to go for specifically what you're going after right now?
Yeah, definitely. So it's an interesting story. So my co-founder and I, we would compete in high school science fairs against each other. And in the Bay Area, science fairs are very, very competitive. People are working on super interesting projects that are, well beyond, my comprehension even today. And I think her work was in imaging and molecular imaging in particular, and trying to look at the early signals of cancer. And my work was building very simple natural language processing models, or in some cases, computer vision models, to do basic tasks. Like one year, I built a summarization engine, and another year, I worked on a simple tool that could classify malaria cells that actually ended up being the precursor for Athelas. But I think the reason that, we started this together, and the reason that we started the company and inspired to keep going, is, when you look at healthcare as an industry in particular, something like 60 to 70% of the costs are in labor and are actually in the services component of healthcare. So when you get a blood test, I was shocked to find out that like literally all the costs of that, like the reagents to run the test cost a couple pennies. The time on the system costs a couple pennies. And then the time of the operator that's, actually pre-processing the blood, and then in some cases analyzing it under a microscope and, manually labeling cells or, writing things down, that's like the $80 that you're paying for that blood test. And you find this, when you just read about healthcare, you see this again and again. Pharmaceuticals, I think politicians, not to get too political, politicians will talk about the pharma industry all day and night. But pharma drug spend is 8% of healthcare spend. Whereas physician time and nurse time is something like 80%. And so, when you think about where the dollars are going, it becomes very clear that, okay, well, we want to tackle problems where we can augment a single physician or a single nurse and make him or her more powerful in order to scale to more patients at the same time. And the way to do that is technology. And I think that we started at this corner of, the goal was always to build a lot more types of tests and a lot more types of sensors and take on more and more of the market. But we wanted to start with something that we knew we could build. It was, technologically possible, and also was hit a large enough chunk of the market. So the CBC, complete blood count, is where we started. It's the most commonly ordered blood test in America. Like you mentioned, it can help detect anything from an infection all the way to leukemia. It really is considered that first wall of a diagnostic. And Deepika, who is way more familiar with healthcare, Deepika is my co-founder, and has worked in a lab for years, if not a decade plus at this point of time. Really identified this as the test to go after, because of just the breadth of conditions it could help solve, and also the fact that she'd seen how it was run in a lab, where it was an automated cell counter, sometimes using, light impedance to track each cell in a large, $100,000 system, combined with a pathologist sitting on a microscope. And both of those things seemed like things we could automate with computer vision, and some basic microfluidics. So we just started running at that problem more out of curiosity to see if we could build it, rather than actually having identified a good market and a good business model yet. It was probably the wrong way to start a company, but we eventually iterated our way into something that now serves a lot of patients and is quite useful.
One of the things when I was kind of browsing through some of your recent activities that I saw on Twitter was this interesting welcome package that your company is using now. Yeah. And can you say a little bit more about what that's all about?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the really exciting things about working at a healthcare business and working on healthcare problems as engineers, as salespeople, as operations people, is that there's this broader mission that is very tangible. I mean, you look at healthcare as an industry. Uh, it's the number one reason for personal bankruptcy in America. We spend $4 trillion a year on it. It's one of the largest drains on the economy. In my opinion, I think in the opinions of a lot of people, there's about three things in the American economy that if you fixed, it would completely change the way that people, I mean, the average middle class American would start living like royalty. And in my opinion, that's healthcare, which is a black hole of wealth often. And, if you go to a hospital once, suddenly there's this $40,000 bill. Um, Also, education. You look at the student loan crisis, you look at the costs it takes to just get, standard education in America, and then real estate. I think that the cost of rent and the cost of actually living in a place, just, the basic action of existing is so expensive in America. And I think that, we're at Athelas hopefully taking on that first problem of healthcare, which is how can we make healthcare lower cost? And how can we use technology to go make that happen? And so in our welcome packet, there's just a really short note that the leadership team and I wrote that, we put into every box, along with the sweatshirt and the jacket that we give people. There's also that note that just talks about, hey, like you're about to start working on this problem of making healthcare more preventative and solving healthcare in America. And I think it does get people excited, and it gets me excited to think about that as a mission that we're growing a team around every day.
Now, I'd love to dive more into all the patients you're serving, but before we do that, I'd like to go a little deeper into exactly what you're doing there. So CBC, complete blood count, what exactly is the result of such a test? What does it have to do? And how are you able to do it so much cheaper than the previous machinery?
The tests that we offer today, white blood cell and neutrophil counts, along with blast cell detection, and we also detect a ton of other types of white blood cells, platelet clumps, et cetera. So a good chunk of the CBC. What's launching, I think, this quarter will be platelets and hemoglobin, which round out the rest of the CBC. And then what you can do with this test essentially is it tells you the number of white blood cells in your bloodstream and the types of white blood cells in your bloodstream. And why this is really useful is, let's take an example of a patient that's on chemotherapy during cancer. When they are receiving chemo, they are receiving a cytotoxic, chemical that's essentially, it means a drug agent that is killing a lot of the fast growing cells in your body, which include tumor cells, but also include some really important cells like neutrophils, which are a type of white blood cell that's an infection fighter. And as a result, these patients become immunocompromised. They can get an infection that might kill them. They can get an infection that might put them in the hospital. And so measuring and tracking that neutrophil count is really important in those populations. Similarly, if there's a patient that has a high propensity for internal bleeding, or post-operative after a surgery, you want to make sure that there's no massive inflammatory process that's, going on. You want to see a good recovery. Well, then you'd want to be measuring platelets and hemoglobin and also white blood cells on an ongoing basis. And so the test really, what we've done is we have a microfluidic test strip cartridge. So with a small volume of blood, a drop, we create a monolayer of cells. So it's a layer, it's single cell thick. And then that test strip, it's a consumable, is inserted into our device, which is about the size of an Amazon Alexa. And we then take hundreds of images of that and classify them using convolutional neural nets that first segment where all the cells are, and then classify the types of cells that are present. So like a pretty standard RCNN that took a lot of time to train and figure out how to optimize. But at its core, the model itself is not something fairly complex. And then after that, we have a count. So hey, these many cells per microliter of this type, and then percentages of the different types of white blood cells and platelets and hemoglobin. And then from that, I mean, a physician or a nurse or any clinician really can take that number and make a determination as to, hey, this patient's counts are really low. Let's give him or her a prophylactic antibiotic, which is a precautionary antibiotic because there's a good chance they might catch an infection. And previously, this process would be like a 3-day turnaround. You would go into the lab, you would get your test result, you'd wait, the results would come back, your doctor would call you, then you'd have to call back in or something or go into some portal. In our case, it's 2 minutes. It's right there. You take the finger prick, the result happens in front of you. And I think number one, and why it's cheaper is there's the intelligence aspect of it has been completely automated with computer vision. And then number two, we've used off the shelf hardware and really simple hardware tools to essentially take what used to be this big $100,000 piece of equipment in a flow cytometer, and then use software to instead supercharge it to use it essentially with a simple optical microscope to classify those cells. And so I'd say what we've done is we've drastically simplified the physical components. A flow cytometer might have something like 400, 500 parts in it. Our system has like 4. And instead, made up for all of the lacking complexity in the light-based impedance and the tubing and all those things that go on in a flow cytometer with software, and just trained that intelligence into a computer vision model. And so that's our core device, the Athelas 1. And then along with that, we've since expanded and we have a suite of other tools for blood pressure monitoring, for detecting hypertension and weighing scales and glucometers. And we've built simple sensors for hardware, for pill tracking when medication adherence. And so all those, our belief is that with these suite of sensors, we can start getting a better picture of a patient's health and preventatively monitor them, and then use simple machine learning models to spot trends or, detect blood cells or whatever it may be to, again, augment the intelligence of a physician or nurse.
So Tanay, I love how you're describing this, because if I heard it correctly, it means instead of having blood drawn, I just prick. I just do a little prick in my finger, and then I swipe the blood into your device, and it takes care of everything else. And can I do this as many times as I want? Is it costly to run the device, or can I run it, any day? Just once I have the device, it's pretty much free to run.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, each test strip costs, us about $1 or $2 to make and manufacture. But other than that, it's all software. And so we've drastically, I think, increased the frequency at which you can run this test as well, which is, like you're saying, currently you have to go in, get a blood draw. And so it's a pretty big deal for immunocompromised populations in that sense.
It seems like it not just changes that you can do things more easily, it'll change how often you're willing to do tests. I mean, getting things scheduled is always a real pain, and now you just do it on your own time. That's amazing. Now, one thing I'm curious about on the AI side of things, you're saying computer vision is used to look at effectively a drip of blood. Somehow images are taken of that blood drip, and computer vision makes sense of it. Now, most machine learning these days, maybe yours too, will require labeled data to be able to actually later do the thing on its own. So where do you get your labeled data from? What's the ground truth for the systems you train?
So when we first started, I'm a big believer in first try to do the thing without machine learning, and then when you actually need to use it, you figure out what the hard parts of the problem are that need a ton of data, then hone in on those. And so when we first started, I mean, we were able to use pretty standard image processing techniques like around, I think we were doing like Otsu transformations and just like edge detection to like classify where the cells were and segment them out, and then like to count So each cell has nuclei in it, and based on the shape and sizes of the nuclei, you can classify the exact type of cell, whether it's a neutrophil, which is an infection fighter, or lymphocyte, etc. And so and even for that, we were doing basic, edge detection and simple transformations, and then counting the number of nuclei, and that worked really well in a simple controlled environment. Now, the second you start having these edge cases in the data, where the cells might be of a slightly different shape or slightly different size, or the lighting in the ambient lighting is a little different. Suddenly, that starts breaking down, and that's where the neural nets that we had to train had to be so robust to all of these perturbations and in edge cases in the different cell types. And so what we did is that we worked with pathologists, between at Stanford, we work with pathologists on contract from a bunch of different institutions, and we created our own label data set of hundreds of thousands of these cells. And then obviously, you use the usual tricks of image augmentation and whatnot to really multiply that data set. And it would work particularly well for cells, because often the transformation you're looking for is a simple rotation, or a simple, the cell is slightly morphed in one direction because of how it's, appeared in the image. And so, with a couple, I'd say like 20 to 30 pathologists, and ourselves also working on the data cleaning and the data auditing process, we sort of created this massive data set, and then we're able to train the neural nets on it. I'd say one really important thing is actually making sure that for example, if we just use a training set from someone looking at these cells on a microscope, there would be some inherent differences than the images collected on our device, which has resolution differences and lighting differences. And so the training set had to be built on the devices that are going to be, actually used. And so the exact lighting, the exact imaging, and the exact resolution. And so that was a challenge, but, it took us over the course of a year. We sort of built this production grade, a computer vision model, and also this production grade data pipeline to go from blood to labeled data with pathologists. And I think early on in a computer vision or just machine learning startup, having production grade data pipelines and production grade labeling pipelines is equally, if not more important than the model itself. And so that's something that, we learned the hard way, but we got through after a bunch of iterations.
These days, one of the things that's often in the news is how some machine learning systems might work well on some subset of a population, but not on other people. For example, face recognition systems were notorious to be less accurate for Black people than white people. And so I'm curious, in blood, is there any such concerns? Like, is it possible that some populations have different types of blood cells, at least in the way they visually appear, that could make it escape the accuracy that you generally achieve? Or
100%. I think if you look at, for example, African American populations will have a higher propensity for sickle cell anemia. It's genetically it is a condition that's far more prevalent in African American populations than others. And it's something that hats off to the FDA, because in the review process with the FDA, these are the things they really hone in on. And which is they want to see, samples from a wide range of demographics. They want to make sure that your both your training sets, as well as, more importantly, when you're actually testing the system and validating it, you're running it across patients with a wide range of diseases, with a wide range of, ethnic backgrounds and age and, all those things. And the other pieces that they really look for is certain rare diseases that might impact the way blood looks and the way blood cells look. And so when you're in the process, it's honestly quite annoying, because they'll mention some rare disease with which there are 20,000 people in the world that have it, and now you have to go find 100 samples of that, and make sure your model is able to perform on it. And so that whenever you get that response, and the FDA will say, hey, we need a patient with this genetic disorder and like this blood disorder, It's a pain because you have to go hunt that down and work with labs and work with clinical facilities to find samples matching that background. But it's really good from a public health standpoint because it actually ensures that your system is robust to these edge cases. And I think for us, and I think in general for, as the technology companies enter healthcare, that's one of the most important things is really ensuring that the models that we build and the models that we validate are robust to the full gamut of the population that they're going to be serving. So yeah, that definitely something we had to work on in a big way.
Well, that's really impressive what you're doing there. And actually, I'm also really impressed that FDA, a government organization, actually gets it right and understands the, how machine learning system or other systems also, of course, need to be tested across a wide range of populations to be able to achieve the desired outcome. Now, one of the other things that, of course, comes up a lot these days, especially with the Theranos trial happening, is, well, wondering what's the difference, right? I mean, Theranos was a company that promised from a little blood prick, you can get everything tested. And here you are actually delivering something similar, but somehow what they were claiming is, wasn't right, and your thing works. So, what's the difference here? Can you say a little bit about what's the difference between Athelas and Theranos in terms of what Athelas provides and Theranos was trying to provide, but is maybe just too hard to do for now?
Yeah, definitely. So I think number one is the test that we have, that we've worked on and cleared by the FDA is a very specific test. It's not 30 blood tests. It's not 100 blood tests from a drop of blood. It really is. It's one or two core blood tests that are very important and highly utilized. And so step one, I think the fact that we're really focused on this one test, the CBC, is I think distinguishing. And then number two is really the focus on strong clinical review, FDA trials, working with peer review with institutions that publish and undergo peer review, and really just honing in on the data. All of our data on the device's performance is available online. The way the device works, is we're talking about it right now. It is super public. I think there's a lot of people that when they're building technology, there's an attempt to obfuscate or an attempt to make it seem more complex than it really is. But I think the beauty of what we're working on is that it is simple and it is actually fairly easy to understand, which is, you take blood, you create a monolayer of it, and then you count the cells. And I'd say one of the more important parts is that this is the way that blood has been, analyzed for decades, if not centuries, which is you look at it under slide, under a microscope, and then you count the different types of cells. All we're doing is we're automating the intelligence portion of that. And so when you look at like the risk factors associated with this, this specific type of test, it all comes down to, well, can you accurately detect the various, cell types that are present, and can you automate something that humans are already very good at, which I actually think is a great example of a problem that machine learning can solve. And at this point of time, I think many industries have shown can solve fairly well. And then finally, I'll say, like, just on a cultural standpoint, one of our big goals was, like I mentioned, data transparency. We work with the FDA from the earliest stages. We meet with them a couple times a year, or have conversations with them at least a couple times a year. So it's super important to us that our interactions with the broader clinical community are one of, we want to work with them, and we want to make sure that when the FDA asks for a trial, I don't think we pushed back once. It was we would run the trial, we would collect the data, we would show that it works. If there was performance limitations, in the labeling, in the conversations with the FDA, those are made transparent and very clear. And so I think just focusing on the science and focusing on the data is one of the ways that we've tried to differentiate ourselves, and also scoping the problem to something that scientifically can actually be done because humans do it every single day today.
Well, Tanay, now, your system, I mean, it's fascinating. It works. Now, if I'm somebody who wants to start using your system, your devices, where do I start?
So today, the system itself is indicated for prescription use only, at the guidance of a clinician. So we work with specific chronic disease populations that really need this type of monitoring on a high frequency basis. Um, One example is there's a refractory schizophrenia drug called clozapine. It's used to treat schizophrenia, and it's very effective, but it has a certain side effect by which in a certain percentage of patients, you do actually see a drop in neutrophil count and in ANC count, which makes them more at risk for developing an infection. And so this is a population that our device has been incredible for, because until today, in order to receive the medication, each patient needed to get a venous blood draw once a week. And with our system, it's transformed that into a finger prick. And doing a finger prick once a week is way different than, doing a venous blood draw once a week, just from a logistics and operational standpoint. So it truly has been life-changing for a lot of those patients. And these are and we talked a little bit about oncology, with chemotherapy and cancer care. So today we're really honed in on delivering great care to those populations. I think the end goal in maybe, a year or 2 years is for us to have enough tests and enough ready to go analytics in the device that it's useful for a general consumer. And it's something that, you can go buy online and have at home. And, it's a prescriber or physician connected device where after a result, a quick consult to parse the results and ensure that you're, understanding them correctly, is in place. And I think that's the goal we're working towards, is how much of healthcare can we transition into the home, and how much of healthcare can we make preventative? And if we can start bringing large pieces of that, I think we'll start bending the cost curve and really drastically reducing costs in the U.S. healthcare system. So that's what, today as a patient, you would have to get prescribed by a physician, have a specific condition that that physician prescribed it for, and then get up and running on the system. And hopefully in the near future, it's something that anyone can just order online.
So I like the example you gave on schizophrenia and the clozapine drug, and now not needing to go in for a weekly blood draw, just a prick at home, and that takes care of it. And also actually read a story on your blog, which was really a great story. I recommend people check out, about a patient whose life was transformed by this, right? I'm curious, are there other diseases aside from schizophrenia where currently Athelas devices are widely used?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have hundreds of cancer patients today who use the system in their home, while they're on treatment, in order to measure for immunosuppression and dose adjust. In autoimmune populations, if it's a patient that's, say, has rheumatoid arthritis or some other condition that needs a infusion, that's a population that we serve in a big way. So in autoimmune populations, you have inflammation is the underlying condition, and you're receiving drugs that are immunosuppressive. So it's similar, to the clozapine use case in some ways, that as you're getting these infusions, you want to be tracking your white blood cell counts for two reasons. Number one, you want to make sure they never go too low because of a risk for infection. But number two, you also want to use it to track the progression of the inflammatory response, which is like, if you're when there's an inflammatory response in your body, a couple of metrics go up. There's a ratio called the NLR, which is neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, which is a strong marker for inflammation and something we can measure. Or the just the total number of white blood cells. I think that's something that's really useful in autoimmune populations. I think there's one story that I don't think is listed on our website, but probably the most important story in the inception of the company, is when we detected leukemia in a patient in our very first clinical trial. And leukemia is a liquid tumor. It essentially manifests as a massive proliferation of white blood cells and immature blood cells in the bloodstream. And so it often stems from an underlying bone marrow disorder. I remember this was the first time we'd ever used the device in a clinical setting. We were just trying to collect data. It was right towards the end of Y-Combinator. Our goal for the summer at YC was to have a system that was functional and passing a basic validation trial. And during the trial, Deepika, my co-founder, was the one that was pricking every patient, and I was sitting in this back room, running the tests and running the samples. And one patient came by and I remember, I got the sample, I ran it, and immediately it was something like 40,000 white blood cells per microliter that the system classified. And on top of that, the cells were also very large, which it was detecting blast cells, which are immature cell types. And we saw that, and immediately I knew this was leukemia. Obviously, our system wasn't FDA cleared at the time, so I couldn't, go tell the patient. I couldn't. I'm not a clinician, so we let the nurses know, and they followed up. And 3 weeks later, the patient was confirmed to have leukemia. And I think for us, this was one of those mind blowing kind of moments where we were like, okay, we built this thing. There's a Raspberry Pi and wires, everything's dangling out of it. It barely works. You have to like hold it together. But it detected leukemia. And that too, it detected leukemia after a patient had visited her doctor, had a consultation, but the diagnosis had gotten missed because, today healthcare system is not particularly quantitative. It's, you'll analyze someone symptomatically, you'll tell them to go home and get rest, which is what she was told. And then if the issue progresses, further symptomatically, then you'll actually stage some sort of an intervention. And when we detected that, I remember on the flight back home, Deepika and I were talking, and we were like, that was the moment we decided to take a leave of absence from school and go full time on this, because it became very, very clear that there was a massive market here. We may not have figured out exactly how to, nail the business side yet, but healthcare wasn't preventative. And the fact that it took us to detect something as severe as leukemia, I think, was telling in the fact that the system needed more preventative technology and more ongoing monitoring technology. Leukemia is another example of a condition that can be detected and monitored using our device, and is used for that today.
And I'm curious, do you ever see the full story? So somebody gets diagnosed, but your device can be used to also monitor them. And, you could hopefully see that your device is also helping them recover and so forth. Do you ever see that, or are you far removed from the recovery stories?
We definitely hear stories of, patients. Usually we're not involved in the detection pathway today. So those are more one-offs, because our system is deployed more for ongoing chronic care where the patient has already been diagnosed. But we do hear incredible recovery stories where a patient will, use the device over the course of several months during their chemo or during their treatment, or on clozapine, they use it every single week. And then the patient gets better and better and better. And that's, honestly, the most exciting thing, where, you see patients, for example, schizophrenia patients who are, a few months ago, just like on the streets in some cases. And then over the course of their treatment with this medication, can now even hold basic jobs, have, living security, have basic, their basic needs met. They have a clinician and caregiver who's taking care of them. And they're receiving their weekly blood tests through Athelas. And one of the things that we've seen now across the thousands of patients that we serve is, when you introduce, Athelas for monitoring, you have a 60% boost in the utilization and adherence to clozapine. So it actually makes sure because it's way easier to take a fingerprint than a venous blood draw. And so it's nice to see those cases where we actively help the patient stay on the medication, and continue to use the medication and benefit from it, and then see that recovery curve for them. Yeah.
Now, this is where you're at today. You started this several years ago. In fact, as I understand it, you started a company at age 15 called Clipped. And then at age 17, I think you started Athelas. Most people are still in high school trying to get ready for college, things like that. What happened there? How did you start a company at age 15 and then the next one at age 17? Can you say a little more about your background there?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that, number one, I'm super lucky to live in an area and a time where there's like, you can just work on these types of things. And so many, like the fact that you can go on GitHub and start, I remember installing NLTK or whatever, the natural language processing toolkit was, and being able to do like some pretty interesting things in a couple of hours. And so Clipped was one of the first apps that I built, and the whole idea was we can use very basic, techniques around named entity recognition and to some extent like sentiment analysis, off the shelf libraries. Really, I was not training things of my own at the time, but the to start to select sentences and paragraphs that are core or summative to the overall article. And so I built this extractive summarization model where it would pull out little infographics, or it would pull out sentences that were core, and you could get a gist, ideally, of the article in a couple in a couple quick seconds, as opposed to reading the whole thing. And I remember I would use it when preparing for debate cases, because we would actually I did high school debate, and so it was a quick way to like pull out the core numbers. And there was like simple pattern matching you could do, like, number and then like the prepositional phrase that comes after it, and then like pull that phrase, and then you can get like, 50% of patients have this issue. And like, and it was a fast way to consume information, and quite personally useful. And at the time, actually, I was really, really fortunate, because I remember I was looking for a summer internship, and I reached out to a bunch of folks at Stanford and the AI lab, and sort of sent them this early thing that I was trying to work on. And I got one response, or I think it was one or two responses. My one response was from Richard Socher, who said, "Okay, cool. You can come intern here for the summer." And he gave me like a task to work on. I think I bungled it. Like, I did not do a good job on it at all, but he still gave me a shot. And so I was really fortunate. He took an early bet on me when I was still in high school. And I learned so much that summer, just absorbing just the work of very intelligent people in that lab. And eventually, that work turned into MetaMind, which was his company. And I had a chance to intern there as well, and learned a ton, and made a ton of mistakes in the process of trying to work on production grade machine learning systems. And then I think while I was there, or a couple months after my internship ended, decided that there was this really interesting problem in applying these computer vision models to things beyond self-driving cars, or beyond facial recognition, but healthcare. And that's when my co-founder and I would talk about it, and we sort of kicked things off. I'd say we left school when I was right after freshman year, right at the beginning of sophomore year. But I'd been working on some of the research ideas in high school as well. It only really came together as a company, I'd say, in the last like three years or so. Until then, we were still figuring things out.
Curious, where did you meet your co-founder?
We grew up in the same area around here, and while I was interning at the AI lab with under Richard, she was working at the multimodality imaging lab, which is like just across the street at Stanford, in Sam Gampier's lab, and so her work was in molecular imaging, and I knew her from science fair projects. Like, we would compete in science fairs in high school, and so I was super familiar with her work. We became good friends. And then when it came time to start something, honestly, the ideas around Athelas were like the perfect confluence of her research in imaging and some what I was interested in with machine learning. And so it seemed like a very natural, natural progression to try to build this thing together.
Yeah, join forces with your biggest competitor from the science fair.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, it still must have been a bit of a conversation, though, because, I mean, normally people, go to college for 4 years, and sounds like you decided after a year, it's just, this is the moment to start a company. I mean, you must have had conversations with your co-founder, with your parents. I mean, what was the dynamic around that?
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting. I think number one, Stanford makes it very easy to come back, and so that was the core of my pitch. Was like, hey, there's this opportunity here. Like, we're doing YCombinator this summer. Sequoia just offered us, a seed round, and it's like, I think I just have to go for the shot. Take my shot here and really spend a couple months and dig into this and see what it can become. I would say that really the conversation came down to, this is an important problem to work on. And number two, I think we have a shot at actually building something here. And number three, if everything just, doesn't work out, then I can always go back to Stanford. They're very accepting of returning at, years down the road. And so that was helpful. It was still just, difficult conversation because the path that I think that we took was just very different. And, all of our friends were in school. It was honestly, there were days when it was kind of like, what are we doing? And especially when you get stuck working on it during a clinical trial or, during a bench trial. But I think what made it all like easier is just the initial couple hires that we brought onto the team were just incredible people that were much smarter than us and much more mature and just did an incredible job of taking this from a hack together science project or idea into a real company. And so we're super fortunate that we got some of those incredible early founding engineers around the table, and many of whom still work with us today, and are, Drew's now the CTO at Athelas, and so he leads the entire engineering team. And so just I think it all somehow clicked in some of those early pieces, and still a lot to figure out, but I'm glad that we took the time off from school to go do it.
It's also my understanding at the time you were the youngest one going through YCombinator. How was that experience?
Yeah, I think there were my batch at YCombinator. There were a couple folks that were around like freshmen in college, freshman or sophomore in college, and so it was cool because I think YC is such a great environment for just that kind of energy where you're in that figuring it out stage. For like Alex, the co-founder of Scale AI, was in our batch, and they're a massive company now and doing incredible work in machine learning. And when they started, they were working on something very different, and mid batch YC it pivoted into the incredible business that Scale is today. And I think a lot of the friends that we made during that batch still, we're super close with. And so really lucky to have been working with such smart people. I'd also say that going through YC at that point of time, it was so important for the business because it gave us this, it paced us. When you're working on your own, when you're outside of school, I think one of the biggest challenges is, well, how do you know how to goal set? And how do you know, like, great, well, what is the metric that I'm going to measure myself on week over week in terms of performance, especially when you're not a consumer app that's launched to the public? And so we I think really we benefited from that structure. We benefited from someone being there to tell us, no, you need to accomplish these things in a week, not a month, and just really pushed ourselves to go make those things happen.
I'm curious, from all the experiences you've had, if there are other, aspiring founders out there, is there some advice you might have of things for them to pay attention to, especially in the early stages of trying to build a new business?
Yeah, definitely. I think the most important thing is giving yourself enough shots on goal. And I think what that means is that oftentimes folks will raise, a couple $1 million or a couple $100,000, and then, that money will burn quick. And then you're left with, it's the number one reason for, companies dying is either the co-founder is splitting or the company just running out of money. And we, what we tried to do is give ourselves enough iterations and enough shots on goal to really figure this thing out. And so iterate really, really fast. Like time is the most valuable resource where, we tried to push ourselves to an experiment or something, the risk that we were trying to mitigate that might take a month. We really were trying to do it in a couple of days. And, so that we could quickly learn and then pivot and change direction as needed from there. And when we started, we really didn't know how to build a business. We had some sense of how to build a technology, but I think we just gave ourselves enough time where we learned the other pieces. And so that was super important. The other advice that I'd give is just, focus on problems that you have a sense for what that end solution and that end workflow looks like. For us, it was so clear because we knew, okay, if we make this into a finger prick, it's going to improve the lives of these patients and these patients and these patients. We now just need to go build it and get it cleared by the FDA. And obviously the commercialization was a lot more complex than we were originally thinking. It's everything is more complex than you originally estimate. But we were able to sprint at one core goal for that initial year and a half phase. And I'd highly recommend that, which is find a simple goal to really just go after, and then go sprint at it. And I think focus is one of the most valuable resources a startup has, which is you can, unlike a big company, you only really have to do one thing well, and then everything else will fall in place. And then you grow from there. So those are some of the things I think we learned along the road.
I like these lessons. And another thing I'm curious about is it seems like one thing you've alluded to is that you've built up a great network of other founders and you can exchange ideas and lessons as you go along. What do you think today would be the best way to build out such a network if you're just getting started? Or maybe even imagine you're not at Stanford. Stanford, of course, is a lot of such activity, but what if you're somewhere else?
I think one of the best ways to do that is the uh, just build stuff, ship some code, and then see if it's some like contributing to open source projects is a huge way to do it. I think the other way is like create a quick MVP and if some project that you're working on, try to get friends to use it, and eventually somehow finds its way to interesting people. I'd also say that there's like Y Combinator truly is like at this point of time, I think the batch sizes are like 200 companies and things like that. And so it's obviously really hard to get into, but we applied to Y Combinator, I think like 3 times. And so, it's one of those things that really changed the trajectory of the company and introduced us to this broader network. I would highly recommend that, it's a great, for first time founders, is a great place to quickly supercharge your network. And it's something that, we really care about in terms of, like when we think about the new companies that are starting now, we try to give back to that Y Combinator network. Both Deepik and I will try to spend time with YC founders and just talk them through some of the early issues that we had. So yeah, I think those are some of the easiest ways to build a network is contribute to some open source community, build, early versions of your project and get it out to people to try to get them to use it or at least criticize it. And then find communities like Y Combinator that I think are strong and the broader YC community as well. They have like startup school and I know they host a lot of events and conferences, both virtual and in person that are really high leverage.
Well, thanks for sharing that today. Now, I'd like to go back a little bit to your bigger vision, which, I mean, ultimately, I imagine is part of why you're able to execute what you're doing. You have to pitch a big vision to your potential funders, where this can all go, how impactful this can all be. And so I'm curious, when you look, let's say 5-10 years into the future, what do you think Athelas could be?
There is going to be a care delivery platform in the home. And what that means is that all of us, healthy, chronically ill, etc., there's going to be devices and sensors and software that we need to transition healthcare into the home. And, I think that there is a massive business to be built doing that. And in parallel, really reducing the costs of healthcare in the country. And so I think what Athelas looks like in 5 years, if things go well, is that we have a suite of blood tests, we have a suite of sensors, some of the things that I already mentioned around, other types of physiological monitoring. And we've successfully paired that with physicians and successfully paired that with in-home medication delivery and a fleet of nurses. I mean, already we have a team of 30 nurses who are responsible for, checking on the results of patients and, coordinating between their doctors and then, and working with, their caregivers. And we're able to, bill for those services via insurance or work with a, physician to bill for those services under insurance. And so I really think that what the end state looks like for us is we have this incredible package of technology products that chronically ill patients, healthy patients can use in the home to passively monitor their health. And we can flag issues before they become severe disease. We can help chronically ill patients manage that severe disease and then avoid hospitalizations and ER visits, which are really what cause all the dollars to be spent in American healthcare today. And I do think that by making, like I mentioned at the beginning, like healthcare is one of those industries that's just this massive suck of wealth in the country. And if we fixed it, it would significantly propel the middle class in a direction that, I mean, again, would make them live like royalty. And so for me, I think that's what we're building towards, is how can we make it so that you can get world-class healthcare, like, Stanford healthcare level healthcare in your home 24/7, on demand. When you want that blood test, you get it. When you want a quick consultation, you get it. When there's when your blood pressure is off, some sensor is picked up on that and flags it as this patient is at risk for developing hypertension or developing, congestive heart failure. And then again, help making it so that people can live longer, healthier lives, while simultaneously putting wealth back into the American economy. So that's the sort of grand vision. And I think there's a lot of steps to get there. And in the process, it's a massive company to build in doing so. So yeah.
Well, I hope that succeeds. That would be great. I'm kind of curious at the individual level. Let's say, just as an individual at home, and you think about preventative health care, right? Are there some diseases that come to your mind where today they're just typically detected too late, and it would be so much better if we had early detection?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a whole range of them. I think there's both disease itself, and then there's also the acute events that, lead to hospitalizations for patients that may already have disease. And so, on the, on the front of those acute events, I think in cancer populations, ER and hospital utilization is way too high. And it's because often a patient will become neutropenic or be at risk of catching an infection and just won't know. And so step one, I think, is building, is making it so that we never miss a neutropenic or, event, ever again. And the way you do that is you get these sensors into the homes of cancer patients. Similarly, there's really simple diseases as well. You look at congestive heart failure, you look at, long-term chronic hypertension and what, the types of things that occur with heart disease and risk for cardiac arrest. One of the biggest killers in the country, one of the biggest, again, drains economically on the healthcare system. So simple to detect, just, tracking weight day over day, tracking blood pressure. It's so simple. And the technology infrastructure doesn't yet exist in order to passively monitor that and pair it with good insights, from a physician or, from a nurse. And so that's something, that we're working on as well, where you have, thousands of blood pressure monitors and weighing scales that we ship every month and get into the homes of patients, and they're LTE connected and show up on a clean dashboard for the doctor. I think that some of the other disease states are at a detection stage. Leukemia, the proliferation of white blood cells and blast cells, it happens, but it can definitely be spotted earlier and earlier. The post-operative setting where a patient might develop sepsis, like a severe infection, and doesn't know about it, again, is something where if you sent them home with an Athelas device, you could get a frequent, platelet, white blood cell, hemoglobin count again and again and again, and then spot that spike or spot that trend, and then avoid it from turning into a hospital visit or into, death in a lot of cases with sepsis. So those are some of the areas, and I think the low-hanging fruit. And long term, I think there's so much signal in our blood, and there's so much signal in our physiological parameters that realistically we should be able to spot a whole host of diseases earlier. Everything from breast cancer to the risk for developing an autoimmune disease. These are things that physiologically will appear. We're just not measuring that signal, and no one is training models on that signal. No one is actually trying to do interesting things with that signal to intervene earlier. And so I would say almost all disease at this point of time, there should be and could be detected earlier with technology that we already have.
Well, that's an exciting future ahead, Tanay. Thanks for working on it. Well, Tanay, thanks for sharing. This is really interesting to learn more about, how you look at the world and who you are aside from work. Really appreciate it. And thanks for the great conversation. I actually learned so much, and I'm really inspired by your vision for the healthcare system of the future, which can be so much more preventative than what we have today and so much cheaper than what we have today. It's going to be amazing. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. This was a ton of fun.